Hello, dear listeners. Welcome back to our podcast, Legal Lore, where law meets the supernatural. I'm Elise, your guide through the mystical corridors of the legal world.
Hi everyone, I'm Juliette, here to add a dash of magic to our discussion today.
And I'm Omid, the Inquisitor in training, who nobody expects.
Now, today we're diving into the fascinating history of witch trials and the ever-evolving legal treatment of the supernatural across Europe and Africa. So grab your cauldrons and broomsticks, folks, because today we're brewing up some legal knowledge.
Absolutely, Elise. So, following the decline of the Roman Empire, European laws concerning witchcraft were largely influenced by barbarian legal codes, such as the Salic law in 6th century France, the Lombard code established by King Ralph in Italy in 643, etc. However, this predominance of barbarian legal tradition, Roman legal concepts regarding witchcraft continued to shape much of the legal framework during the early modern witch trials. Today, combined estimates for Europe, Scandinavia, and America suggest that there were between 90,000 and 100,000 witch trials conducted during the period from 1400 to 1800. The peak of these trials occurred between 1560 and 1630, often regarded as the worst time for witch hunts overall. Approximately half of these prosecutions took place in German territories, with several thousand occurring in Baden-Württemberg alone. Neighboring states, especially Switzerland, saw around 10,000 trials. In the borderlands of Lorraine, there were 5,000 trials, while in the larger Kingdom of France, there were just 3,000.
I would also like to add that in the early modern period, it's the time period we're talking about here, the cycles of witch hunting occurred in significant waves that peaked with moments that challenged the legal sovereignty of European monarchs, or in other cases, the unity and sanctity of the Catholic Church. The continent would go decades without significant witch hunting frenzies, and then suddenly erupt, including cases of the Counter-Reformation, the 30 Years' War, and the English Civil and Revolutionary periods.
Okay, well, that's pretty interesting, but let's also dive into the case of England, where the legal saga of witchcraft took some intriguing turns. Now imagine this. Before 1542, witchcraft was solely under the purview of ecclesiastical courts. But with the Witchcraft Act of 1542, things changed dramatically.
That's right, Elise. The act made performing witchcraft a statutory offence, marking a turning point in the legal landscape. Suddenly, witchcraft was a matter for secular law, and this paved the way for more developments down the road. And let's not forget the Elizabethan Witchcraft Act of 1563, which really added some spice to the mix. It introduced penalties like the death penalty for using witchcraft to cause harm to others, along with imprisonment and public shaming for other offences. It truly added layers to the legal framework, distinguishing between different types of magical practices. It was a time when witch trials were at their peak, with thousands facing prosecution across England, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries.
It's also critical to ground the development of the legal frameworks promoting witch hunting with the proclamation and spread of Anglicanism as a sect of Christianity in England. Prior to the reign of Queen Elizabeth's father and predecessor, Henry VIII, witch hunts were used as tools of kings in service of the Catholic Church, or in an attempt to just claim legitimacy with the clerical institutions of their country, all linked to Rome. With the advent of the Anglican Church, though, with His Majesty the King as the sovereign of both state and church, the purpose of witch hunting became doubly invested in the person of the monarch. And Queen Elizabeth, herself a monarch, interested in the occult and divine, and there's lots of studies about how that all took place. She studied and utilized the law for purposes of religious absolutism to her fullest capabilities.
I love Queen Elizabeth. Of course I do. The Elizabethan and the Jacobean Acts really set the stage for what we know about trials in England. But then if we fast forward to the Witchcraft Act of 1736 and the Vagrancy Act of 1824, these laws ushered in an entirely new era of legal discourse.
Yes, you're right. It's important to mention that these acts brought in the presumption of impossibility, essentially saying that any paranormal practice couldn't deliver on its promises. Courts started assuming deceit, especially when money was involved. And let's not forget the case of Monk versus Hilton. The court broadened the definition of paranormal, including things like conducting seance under the umbrella of fortune telling. It was a time of grappling with what exactly paranormal meant in the legal context. The courts were hesitant to define supernatural agency, leaving us with this intriguing, open ended legal puzzle. Then, in R versus Gilles, the defendant claimed to resurrect the victim's deceased husband, and the courts had to navigate this tricky territory without a clear definition of the supernatural. It was a time of flux, especially as English law moved away from theological roots towards property rights and commercial exchange.
The transition of the view of the supernatural through the lens of the law and reason, as opposed to those of religion and faith in the context of witch hunts, occurred within a broader scholarly debate that at one point even involved the King of England. Now, we're going to go back a little bit in time, before the Witchcraft Act of 1736. We'll arrive at an interesting character named Reginald Scot. He was a member of Parliament and a philosopher in his own right. He wrote a book called The Discovery of Witchcraft as an expose of early modern witchcraft, explaining how many experiences of witchcraft by the population were ultimately the equivalent of individuals being tricked by charlatans and stage magic. Scott believed that the prosecution of those accused of witchcraft was irrational and not Christian, and he held the Roman Church responsible, which at the time was the main institution promoting them. Popular belief held that all obtainable copies of his book were burned on the accession of James I, Elizabeth I's Scottish Catholic cousin, in 1603. King James, in turn, had at that time published his Daemonology as a rebuttal of Scott's work. Essentially, it's a philosophical dissertation on contemporary necromancy and the historical relationships between the various methods of divination used from ancient black magic. The laws that would promulgate after his reign, though, would lean far more on the skeptic's position against that of the king, as Juliet was mentioning.
Oh, and now a modern twist in the tale. We have the Fraudulent Mediums Act of 1951, and this act repealed older laws focusing on mediums and spiritualistic practices. But guess what? Very few prosecutions ever resulted from it.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the law evolved over 450 years from outright criminalization to the somewhat regulated commodification of the paranormal, all rooted in the principles of private property and clear exchanges.
Okay, but what about France? Juliet, tell us about France.
Oh, okay. So let's start with a fascinating tidbit. Unlike many other parts of Europe, France tried witchcraft cases in secular courts, especially the famous Parliament of Paris. This court, the oldest and largest appellate court in Europe, had its hands full with witchcraft trials from the 15th century all the way to the end of the old regime. Picture this. In the early 16th century, witch trials were rare in France. But then, in 1572 to 73, the Parliament of Paris saw a sudden surge in appeals. 16 cases in just 1 year. And by 1609 to 1610, that number skyrocketed to 34 appeals. So it was a time of heightened tension and accusations. One striking case from 1540 involved a young man sentenced to death for witchcraft. His parents appealed, and the Parliament of Paris stepped in, overturning the verdict. They even investigated the local seigneur and legal officers involved. Talk about judicial drama.
Couldn't get more dramatic. And there's also the case of 2 shepherds executed for stealing Eucharists on behalf of an alleged witch. So the Parlement of Normandy didn't hold back in punishing all of those who were involved in such acts of sacrilege.
Exactly. But decriminalized in 1682, witchcraft was officially off the legal books by the time of the French Revolution in 1791. The revolutionaries saw it as a crime created by superstition and wanted no part of it in their new legal system. Even medical circles were moving away from the belief in witches, seeing it more as a delusion than reality. But despite these shifts from the French Revolution to the brink of the Second World War, many in France still believed in the power of witchcraft to harm others. Shockingly, over 650 criminal cases related to witchcraft were recorded during this time. From 1791 to 1940, at least 67 men and women tragically lost their lives under suspicion of witchcraft, with many more facing assaults and prosecutions.
The extrajudicial nature of the vast majority of these witch trials we're talking about, or any violence as a result of an accusation of witchcraft, is at least somewhat relevant as well. The last official execution of a witch in the Dutch Republic was probably in 1613. In Denmark, this took place in 1693, with the execution of Anna Pallas. And in Norway, the last witch execution was of Johan Nilsdatter in 1695. In Sweden, it was Anna Eriksdatter in 1704. In other parts of Europe, the practice died down later. In France, the last person to be executed for the crime was Louis de Barras in 1745. In Germany, the last death sentence was that of Anna Schwegelein in 1775, although that was never carried out. And the last known official witch trial on the books anywhere in Europe was the Doruchov witch trial in Poland in 1783.
Wow, so that's a pretty sobering reminder of how deeply these beliefs were entrenched in society. But interestingly, a lot of these cases weren't about witchcraft per se, but about fraud or violence allegedly incited by the belief in witchcraft. So what about Africa, for example?
Well, Africans brought to the Americas as slaves shared this belief in the harmful spiritual practices. Unlike Europe, where skepticism was rising, African beliefs in witchcraft remained steadfast. Early legislation in the English and French colonies targeted African religious practices, especially drumming. So, drumming was a vital part of many African rituals, and it was seen as a potential threat to security by colonial authorities. But moving to South Africa, for instance, British colonial rule led to the criminalization of witchcraft. In response to violence related to witchcraft accusations, the provincial government of Mpumalanga, and I'm not sure once again I'm pronouncing this right, established a commission in 1995, led by anthropologist Victor Ralushai. So he commissioned he commissioned a 300-page report in 1996 that recommended criminalizing witchcraft, proposing imprisonment for up to 4 years. And with that, they aimed to create a legal framework for genuine cases of witchcraft, separating them from political or personal vendettas.
One interesting anecdote was relayed by Audrey Richards in 1935, where a new wave of witch finders, termed the Bamuchapi, appeared in the villages of the Bemba people of Zambia. They dressed in European clothing, funnily enough, and they would summon the headmen of these villages to prepare a ritual meal. When the villagers arrived, they would view all of these villagers in a mirror, and after they claimed they could identify witches with that method. The witches, identified by these witch hunters, would then have to yield up their horns. And, in Zambian culture at this time, they had horn containers for drinking and eating, and they would have to give them over because these witch hunters would claim that evil potions were kept in those horns. The Bamuchapi made them all drink another potion called the Kuchapa, which would cause a witch to die and swell up if he ever tried such things again. So people didn't really die because of the witch hunters, but anyone who did not attend the meal, the villagers who refused to be part of this tradition, would then be identified and then killed.
Oh, so the dichotomy between African beliefs and Western legal principles is really evident in these examples. And the African Renaissance, I'm going to put that in quotation marks, emphasized the importance of witchcraft in African society while legal frameworks struggle to accommodate these beliefs.
Yes, exactly. So the Witchcraft Suppression Bill proposed in 2007 by Mpumalanga revived debates about African traditions and legal universalism. The bill aimed to transform traditional customs in line with the Constitution, prohibiting accusations of witchcraft. The bill also aimed to regulate traditional healers who play a crucial role in protecting against witchcraft. And this intertwining of witchcraft and healing traditions kind of reflects the complex debates over religion and cultural practices.
And what about modern Africa today?
So today, accusations of witchcraft disproportionately affect women, especially elderly women. These accusations often lead to exile, torture, or even death. An example from northern Ghana in 1997 during a meningitis outbreak highlights the tragic consequences of such accusations. Elderly women, once revered as protectors, became targets of violence and persecution. Legal reforms like the Witchcraft Suppression Act of 1957, which we just described in South Africa, outlawed accusations but left individuals vulnerable to vigilante justice. Cameroon state courts in the 1980s relied on diviners' testimony to convict alleged witches. Interestingly, new forms of witchcraft have emerged in contemporary times, reflecting modern concerns. In Cameroon, for instance, the concept of famla or ikong emerged, where the nouveau riche, basically, are supposedly transformed into into zombies, sorry, to work on invisible plantations. God. Scholars interpret these new forms of witchcraft as reflections of capitalist exploitation and the complexities of modern African society. The resurgence of occult practices and accusations within Pentecostal movements shows that modernity in Africa is actually quite diverse and intertwined with traditional beliefs.
Interestingly, many African countries utilize their legal institutions in state-sponsored, or at the very least state-guided witch hunting, kind of along the lines of what Juliet was saying. In R versus Hlupo, a successor case of South Africa's Witchcraft Suppression Act, spectral evidence was allowed into the courtroom. Essentially, the dream of a witch hunter was indirectly permitted as valid evidence in justifying that witch hunter's further investigation into women accused of witchcraft. The merits of the practice of witchcraft were also in dispute in K. Hassani versus Kisiku and Chali. This was a Tanzanian case regarding slander of an elderly man by a local witch hunter. In that case, the man's religious practices had to be analyzed by a court of law to determine if they could properly be classified as witchcraft for the veracity prong of illegal slander under Tanzanian law.
All right, and there you have it. Our exploration of witchcraft in Africa, from traditional beliefs to modern manifestations. Now, join us next time as we uncover more mysteries of the supernatural world.
Yeah, merci everyone, and à la prochaine. Remember to keep an open mind and explore the fascinating intersections of law and the unseen.
Thank you, guys.